Hello brothers, welcome back to Church History 2. This is our 12th video for the course, and today we are going to be moving into our fourth major theme for this course, that is the gospel in a global context. The big question here is, what does it look like for the gospel to go into all the world? When Christianity began, it was the religion of a particular group of people who were believers within a Jewish context in and around Jerusalem. But before long, it spread beyond Jerusalem and moved into the Roman Empire, which took it into both Europe, Africa, as well as Asia. It also continued to move east, taking up root in the Persian Empire, spreading down eventually into Afghanistan and Iraq and Mesopotamia, across into Mongolia, down into Western China even, and of course down into India as well, and to many other places over the years. In each one of those places, Christianity looked different, and by and large, Christians have acknowledged that this is sort of normal and okay, because we say, well, there are some things that are essential to the Christian faith. That is, we must always, of course, preach the gospel. We must have the Bible. We must understand the essential theological components of our faith. But on the other hand, there are some things that are not essential to the faith, some things that can be changed and shifted from culture to culture. So, for example, what time should we meet on Sunday morning? That's probably not an essential matter. Different congregations and different churches in different places at different times will come to a different answer on that, and that's okay. So too, what language should we be conducting our services in? Should we have seats or pews? These things are not entirely neutral, but nor are they of the essence of the faith. Does our church have to be made of brick? Can it be made of wood? What about straw and mud huts? Are those acceptable? Well, I think most people would say for sure. So this question of what is essential, what is not essential, this is an important one. But what it raises is a larger question, a question about unity and diversity. Because while everyone might agree that it doesn't matter whether the church is built of stone or marble versus wood and mud and straw. Everyone might agree about that. But then there are other more complicated and more difficult questions that we must answer. And it is that problem of unity and diversity. How is it that the church can remain one, while at the same time there are many different versions of the church that exist across the world? That has been a challenging question for the church to address, and in particular, it becomes more challenging as the church begins its geographic expansion. Now, you know well already that the church did not begin to expand in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. You know that the church had already expanded, and that there were many parts of the world, and I'm even thinking of parts outside of the Roman Empire. There are many parts of the world that already had indigenous Christian churches. We can think, for example, about Ethiopia and even down into Sudan, to the Axiom kingdom of the Middle Ages, down into the Middle East, as I just mentioned, down into Asia, or over into Asia, east into Asia. All of these places had indigenous Christianity that had no European roots. This was not Christianity by way of Europe. This was indigenous Christianity that came from the sources. And yet, during the 15th century, Christians in Europe began a mighty period of geographic expansion. Sometimes this was done under the auspices as part of a program of exploration. Let's go and see what's out there. Sometimes this was done under the auspices of settlement. Let's go and stay in a place, right? We'll become sojourners in a foreign land. Sometimes this was done under the context of conquest and colonialization. We are going to move into an area, perhaps conquer it if anybody is there, and move in and establish our own societies in those places. So there were various ways in which Europeans began to move into other parts of the world, but beginning in the early 15th century and continuing, at least into the late 18th century, we see a dramatic geographical expansion occurring for European powers. And the mission movement that flew out of that, that is to say, as Europe began to expand, so too did Christianity. If we can think about a mission movement, and I think we can during this earlier period, what we're looking at is one that was dominated primarily by Catholics up into the 1700s, into the 18th century. By and large, Protestants were not doing much in the way of global missions. At the end of the 18th century, 1792 is usually the date given, the end of the 18th century, there is a new effort on the part of Protestants to engage in mission. And this is often called the modern mission movement. It lasts from 1792 to 1910. And we'll talk in a bit about those specific dates, but 1792 to 1910. So let's talk about this geographic expansion that occurs as Europe begins to go into other places in the world. This is really the first time that Europe, especially by way of water, had made this degree of geographic expansion. In the early 15th century, Portugal was the early innovator in this process. Portugal, which sits way off into the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded on all sides, either by water or by Spain, Portugal found itself really quite separated from the rest of Europe. And so they figured that they had either better let Spain conquer them or learn to sail boats, and they chose to do the latter. Portugal was particularly interested in trying to find a way around Africa to get to India. They knew that India was there, but they didn't know how to get there. Now, the easy way for this to happen would simply have been for the Portuguese to go into the Mediterranean Sea, pass through the Middle East, get into the Red Sea, and then take the Red Sea out into the Indian Ocean, and from the Indian Ocean, it's just a quick boat ride into India. Of course, the Portuguese couldn't do that. And the reason they couldn't do that was because of Islam. Islam controlled that entire region, and they were not willing to allow Christians to pass through it, and certainly not for the sorts of reasons that the Portuguese were trying to. Why were the Portuguese trying to get to India? They were basically trying to do two things. On the one hand, they were interested in making money, and they knew that the great wealth of the world was in the East, in places like Japan and China, and of course, India. India had spices. Europe didn't have spices, and if they could get access to those Indian spices, well, they could become quite wealthy, which they did. The second thing that they were looking for were Christians. They wanted to find Christians, and in particular, they wanted to find a specific Christian. The Christian that they were looking for was a man named Prester John. There had, during the Middle Ages in Europe, grown up a great myth, a great story about a Christian king named Prester John, who lived somewhere over there in the Far East. And perhaps he lived in India, or at least perhaps the Indians would know where he was. And the idea was that if the Portuguese and the Christians in Western Europe could connect up with Prester John, then they could ally themselves together and they could attack from both sides the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Turks, and conquer them, and this would be good. They could have a big crusade and overthrow the Muslim Turks, and then Christianity would be triumphant, and presumably Christ would return soon after Jerusalem had been retaken. Well, to a certain extent this worked. When they arrived in India, in Goa, they found spices. They also found Christians, the Martoma Christians, the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, but they did not find Prester John. Nevertheless, this was merely the first in a long series of exploratory and expansionistic voyages that European powers would engage in. So not just Portugal, but Spain, also another very early adopter. Portugal, Spain, France to a lesser extent, but nevertheless in some important ways. In Canada, right, in North America, and in a number of islands, both in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic as well. Great Britain or England at this point until the 18th century. It was just England. England was involved, of course, in traveling many parts of the world, not least of all India eventually. Russia expanded across Asia during this period. They weren't so much going by boat, but they were going by land, expanding into the territory that is now part of Russia, and moving across the Bering Strait into North America to take what is now Alaska. They moved, and then finally we want to mention here the Dutch as well, those from the Netherlands. The Netherlands became an important exploratory and trading power during the 17th century especially. These early exploratory and expansionistic voyages by European powers had a complicated relationship to missions. Take the Portuguese example. The Portuguese traders and merchants did not want missionaries to go with them. They didn't want priests to come with them. Why didn't they want priests to come with them? Because they knew that those priests would cause them to behave themselves, and they wanted to be free to do whatever they wanted to do. However, the Portuguese king was quite stern with them and demanded that they take missionaries along. And in most of the powers, most of these European powers who were going out and doing this expansion, a similar sort of mentality maintained. That is to say, the state often encouraged them, or in some cases, the company that was in charge of this exploration. I'm thinking here, for example, of the British East India Company, or the Dutch East India Company. They would encourage ministers to go along in these voyages. Not necessarily as missionaries, but often to serve those who would go and move to those areas. So as colonies were established, as settlements were established within foreign territories, you wanted to have a minister to minister to you so you could hear sermons and take the sacraments, and so on. So there's this complicated relationship to missions then. Let's pivot a little bit here. I want to talk now about some specific early Catholic missions. Why talk about Catholic missions? Well, because the Catholics are doing it first. And the problems that they run into in the 16th and the 17th and the 18th century are the same sorts of problems that the Protestants are going to run into in the 18th and the 19th and the 20th century. So it's worth really spending some time talking about what the Catholic missionaries are doing. One of the great figures here, well, let me say this first. The great Roman Catholic missionaries of the early modern period, of the 16th and the 17th century, are the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus, a religious order that was founded in the 16th century by Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius Loyola founded the Jesuits. The Jesuits were, on the one hand, meant to be missionaries, to go out and to bring the gospel to other places. On the other hand, they were meant to be those who would resist the spread of Protestantism. For both of these jobs, the Jesuits needed to be very well trained, very well educated, and they were. The Jesuits had an extremely rigorous process of education. And when you went on the field as a Jesuit, you had the tools and the training to do your work well. One of the things that Jesuits became famous for was for learning languages, and the Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci, who lives from 1552 to 1610, was one of the greatest of these. Ricci was actually a missionary to China, the first missionary to China. He arrived there in 1582, and he was a truly spectacular linguist. Chinese is a difficult language. He learned Mandarin. Chinese is a difficult language, and Ricci learned it perfectly. In fact, he didn't just learn to speak it fluently, he learned the entire culture. Ricci was so good at Chinese that he was able to impress even the most learned and cultured members of Chinese society. He was even invited to visit the Forbidden City, that is the palace complex within Beijing. No Westerner had ever been allowed to go there. He was allowed to meet the emperor himself. How did Ricci attain this skill? The thing about Ricci, apparently, was that he had a truly phenomenal memory. And he worked at it. He developed this memory. It wasn't natural to him. It wasn't that he had this when he was born, but he developed this memory. He used a practice called the memory palace, which basically he would visualize within his head a large household. And when he wanted to memorize something, he would connect everything that he wanted to memorize to a different room in the house. And then when he wanted to recall something, he would simply bring that to mind, and he would walk through his memory palace, connecting each one of those different things that he had memorized. Now, this seems a strange way to memorize things, and I've never really tried it, but apparently Ricci was so capable with this that he would go to dinners and people would challenge him. They would recite large sections of Chinese poetry or of Chinese classical literature. They would recite it from memory, and then they would challenge him to recite it back. And Ricci could do this. Not only could he recite word for word what they had just told him, you're not going to believe this, he could do it backwards. He could take their words and recite them backwards to them. Amazing. So, Ricci, very, very capable missionary, learned the language, learned the culture, was able, in fact, to write books in Chinese. And among them, he wrote a very interesting book, a book called The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven. And he wrote this in Chinese first. It was translated as well into European languages, into Latin and then other European languages. What is interesting about this book, now I'm going to say more about this in a minute, but what's interesting here is that when he translated the word Lord of Heaven, he chose to use a Chinese word, the word Tian, which means, well, heaven, literally, but Tian is the name of a sort of deity, right? A Chinese deity, the deified heavens. So this is interesting. Ricci chose to use a Chinese word that connected the God of the Bible to the religion that existed in China. This is emblematic, this is indicative of the sort of missionary strategy that Ricci employed more generally. What he wanted to do was he wanted to take Chinese civilization and make Christianity make sense within it. It occurred to him that just as in Europe, Aristotle had been used to make Christianity understandable, it occurred to him that perhaps the great philosophy of China could also be used to make Christianity understandable. That is, could he take Confucianism and make Christianity speak in a sort of Confucian tongue? This was his strategy. To that end, Ricci actually dressed like a Confucian scholar. He spoke like a Confucian scholar. He didn't go and preach on corners and proclaim the gospel to people. Instead, he had quiet meetings. He went to dinner parties and social engagements. He talked about some of the scientific endeavors and breakthroughs that existed in Europe, and he shared those with elite members of Chinese society. And they were very interested in his globes, in his maps, in his chronometers that allowed him to tell time. And then, as he began to make his way into Chinese society, he began to share with them elements of the gospel. And some of them began to convert. In fact, the missions in China, although they converted relatively few people, did have a significant impact over the long term in Chinese society. Now, this all sounds fine so far, but what happened in later centuries, in decades and centuries, led to a great deal of controversy. You see, as Ricci and his successors were attempting to contextualize Christianity to a Chinese worldview, to a Chinese context, they had to make all sorts of difficult choices. So one of those choices was, how do you translate Christian terms into another language? Well, you know very well that that is really, really challenging, because the words that you choose as you translate into a target language often have baggage that comes with them. Ricci's strategy, as indicated by the title of his book, The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, was to draw heavily upon Chinese words and use those words to communicate Christianity. So rather than, for example, choosing to take the word Lord and simply impose it, right, into Chinese, and find perhaps syllables and characters that sort of sounded like the word Lord, or you would probably use Dominus, the Latin word for it. Instead of doing that, he chose to use the word Tian, right, a word that had a specific meaning within a Chinese context. He chose to dress Christianity within Confucian language. But of course, each one of these choices had consequences. And especially this choice to connect Christianity to Confucian philosophy. Because it wasn't clear, in fact, that Confucianism was merely a philosophy. When other missionaries began to arrive in China, and in particular, missionaries who were associated with the religious order of the Dominicans, not the Jesuits, but the Dominicans, and there had been a long ongoing feud between the Jesuits and the Dominicans. When the Dominicans came on the scene and they realized Ricci's strategy, they said, no, you can't do that. Confucianism is not a philosophy, it's a religion. It's a religion, not a philosophy. And you are trying to take Christianity and syncretize it with another religion. What you're going to get is idolatry, a mixed religion, a false religion. You're teaching people to worship false gods. You can't do that. This controversy exploded around a specific issue that became known as the Chinese Rite controversy. The Chinese Rite controversy was this: if a Chinese Christian goes and pays homage, right, shows reverence for his dead ancestors by lighting incense, by bowing before an image of them, perhaps even offering up a sort of prayer to them, is this idolatrous ancestor worship, or is this simply the Chinese way of obeying the commandment that says, honor your father and your mother? Well, the Jesuits said it was the latter. The Dominicans said it was the former. These issues of cultural practice versus religious practice were incredibly difficult to navigate. Who could know exactly what was going on in the hearts of individual Chinese believers who were performing these practices? Well, having spent some time considering the difficulties and challenges that Jesuit missionaries faced as they attempted to contextualize the gospel for China, let's turn our attention now to India and see some of the ways in which those same sorts of problems played out. India was, if anything, an even more difficult and complicated context than was China. Early on, as I mentioned, merchants didn't particularly want to have missionaries or priests come along with them, but this was certainly the case by the 1540s, that Jesuit missionaries were beginning to accompany those merchant ships and establish churches and mission works within the context, especially of Goa, but some other places as well. Here, the early key figure is the Jesuit Francis Xavier, who lives from 1506 to 1552. Xavier was one of the great Jesuit missionaries. He was actually an original Jesuit, one of the first companions of Ignatius Loyola, and he arrived in India in 1542. He stayed there for about 3 years until 1545, mostly in Goa, and there he attempts to spread the gospel. He does this in particular by working mostly among lower caste Christians. And then he leaves. Right? In 1545, he goes off to Japan. We're not going to talk about his work in Japan, except to say that it's interesting to note that when he gets to Japan, he changes his strategy. Rather than trying to work with lower class Japanese, he begins to focus his energy on upper class Japanese, on samurai, daimyo, and nobles. Robert de Nobili, or Roberto de Nobili, whose dates are 1577 to 1605, was the great successor to Francis Xavier. He arrived in India in 1605, and he stayed there for more than 50 years. De Nobili's practice was unlike Francis Xavier. De Nobili's practice was to dress as a sannyasi, right? So as a sort of ascetic. He dressed like one, he acted like one, he went around. So here we have, like Ricci, an effort to contextualize the gospel into a very much Indian context. Now, it's interesting that de Nobili did this because in India, there had actually been previous efforts by some of the early arrivals to do something very different. And I want to contrast this approach by de Nobili, where he is attempting to work very much within the context of Indian culture, to dress like an ascetic, to speak the native tongue, and to appropriate and contextualize the gospel. I want to compare this with an earlier effort by a Dominican friar named Duarte Nunez. Nunez comes to India in 1522. He is actually sent as a representative from the Portuguese king, and his job is basically to make a report and to indicate how he thinks it would be best for them to bring Christianity to India. And so here's what he says. I'll read you a letter that Duarte Nunez wrote to the King of Portugal. He says, "It would be a service to God to destroy these Hindu temples just in this island of Goa and to replace them by churches with saints. Anyone who wishes to live in this island should become a Christian, and in that case may retain his land and his houses just as he has them at present. But if he is unwilling, let him leave the islands. It may be that these people will not become good Christians, but their children will be, and so God will be served, and also your Highness by becoming the cause of salvation to so many lost souls." So Nunez wants to create a Christian enclave in Goa. He wants to destroy all of the Hindu temples. He wants to build churches. He wants to force everyone who lives there to be a Christian. If they don't want to become Christians, then they have to move somewhere else. But everybody who stays in Goa has to become a Christian. This is his plan. And he says, I know, most people are just going to get baptized because they want to stay in their homes. But their children will become good Christians. And so Duarte Nunez has this long-term vision of reaching the young ones so that the church will eventually grow in the next generation. And these two approaches, Duarte Nunez's approach and de Nobili's approach, I think represent very different strategies for missionary endeavor and for bringing the gospel into different contexts. Now, I'm not going to say here which one of these I think is a better approach. I will allow you to think about that, and I'll encourage you to do so, because I think this is an important and interesting question for us to think about, and especially you, as you are doing the hard work of translating Christianity into largely Hindu and in some cases Islamic context, where it is not always particularly welcome. Let me give you one other piece of the puzzle here before we break for the day. One other piece of the puzzle in India is that, of course, there were already Christians in India. The Mar Thoma Christians, the St. Thomas Christians. And increasingly, in the 16th century, there began to be conflicts between the Catholics who were operating under the authority of papal commission, right? So these are Roman Catholics, and those Thomas Christians who see themselves as part of a larger Church of the East and under the authority of the Chaldean Patriarch. Unfortunately, in 1552, there's a great schism that opens up in that Church of the East, and this leaves the St. Thomas Christians a little bit unsure of what they ought to do and where they ought to go. In 1599, the chief clergyman, the chief priest in India, so this would be the Roman Catholic representative here, calls for a synod. This is usually called the Synod of Diamper or the Synod of Udayamperur. Udayamperur, sorry for my pronunciation on that. Again, at this synod, he gathers together a large number of the congregations, the priests, who are Mar Thoma Christians, and I won't say forces, but puts a lot of pressure on them to bring them under the obedience and authority of the Pope. And so for a period of time following 1599, these St. Thomas Christians are now under papal dominion. But the relationship is not good, and it continues to go sour. So here we have, rather than sort of an effort to contextualize, we have a sort of heavy-handed effort on the part of the Roman Catholic Church to try and bring these Mar Thoma Christians into the Catholic fold. What ultimately happens, you may know this story, but 53 years later, in 1653, the Mar Thoma Christians basically refuse Roman obedience. They take, at the great oath of the bent cross, they break away, and from this point on, there's a complicated and confusing relationship that unfolds over the next, 400 years or so. As it exists now, some members of the Mar Thoma community do exist under papal obedience, but other parts of the Mar Thoma community do not. Turns out there is a tremendous amount of variety. So what we've seen here is that in the early years of Western missionary efforts, we have a variety of different strategies that are employed. Some heavy-handed strategies, some who thought that the only way to do missions was to root out completely and destroy the existing religious culture and establish something new. There you have Duarte Nunez. Others, like Ricci and De Nobili, who said, no, the best way to proceed is to try to fit Christianity within the culture that already exists. As we'll see next time, many of these same strategies were employed by Protestant missionaries in the later centuries. For now, we'll call it a day. God bless you, brothers. I'll see you next time.